Welcome to my response discussing the representations of women in video games. Finally. This video will blend together ideas from literature, philosophy, psychology, pop culture, and a few ideas of my own in order to analyze aspects of what we're really talking about here. Story. And it turns out stories are fundamental in how people view and construct frames that they use to make sense of the world. That's how cultures were formed. But parts of my approach may be more aberrant than the kinds of standard scientific views you're accustomed to hearing. For example, the standard Newtonian view of reality says the world is made out of objects and is at its core a material place. And while it has given us a lot of agency as the dominant species on this planet, there are huge limitations to that kind of view. It denies human agency, creativity, and emotion. It doesn't give a place where you can conceptualize something like a motivation, emotion, dream, desire, and those are all phenomena that are still very mysterious to neuroscientists still. The reason I'm opening with this is because models of the world that involve and include phenomena such as motivation, consciousness, actions, and interactions between people are portrayed formally in stories, not in other analyses. That's how people for thousands of years shared knowledge and information. The stories themselves have identifiable structures that make them understandable to our consciousnesses and subconsciousnesses. Even a simple story, if it is well constructed, can have an unbelievably profound meaning that can strike deep chords within ourselves and beings. So, without further ado, I give to you the real Damsels in Distress 1. Tropes and women in video games. She said without further ado too, didn't she? I'd like to start off by spinning a few yarns of my own and discussing a few games with female protagonists that were bought and sold. Everyone is familiar with Samus Aran from Metroid and Chun-Li from the Street Fighter series. Arguably two of the most identifiable early generation female characters, maybe apart from Peach. But they weren't the only early female protagonists. Ms. Pac-Man often gets credit for being the first female in gaming. Actually, she wasn't the first female character. In 1981, Coleco made Ladybug in an effort to draw more girls into the arcade. In fact, Pac-Man was created to be more girl-friendly too. Ladybug was played pretty much like Pac-Man with one notable exception. The player could alter the shape of the maze. The game was popular enough for Intellivision, Atari 2600, and ColecoVision home ports. But then again, they ported everything back then, which helped lead to the supposed video game crash of 1983. Kangaroo was also a female character protecting her lost baby from monkeys. Those damn dirty monkeys. But I would hardly call Ladybug a kangaroo, and whatever the hell the packs were supposed to be a triumph for women in video games. Hell, they aren't even people. There were actually more female protagonists in early gaming through the 1980s and 1990s that many people may not be familiar with. Poma and Jenna started below the root. In 1984, Papri of Girls' Garden marks the first human female protagonist in Japan. The first action heroine was Kunoichi, Ninja Princess, in 1985. The Sega Master System port replaced her with a male, though. Reika Kirishima, the protagonist of Time Gal in 1985, was the first female protagonist in a story-driven game, though her character design and overall demeanor was highly sexualized. The first non-gendered female was Tobi Kissy Masuyo, the protagonist of Baraduke. She was the first non-sexualized female video game character. Her gender was not revealed until the ending, a year before Metroid did the same thing with Samus Aran. In 1984, the Tower of Jiraga is where you had to go rescue the damsel in distress, Key. She marks the first rescued damsel that comes back to co-star in a game, The Return of Ishtar. The Wing of Medulla, published by Sunsoft and released in 1986, has Lucia, and she marks the first female that turns this cliché on its head, as she was set to rescue the prince along with freeing her homeland. In fact, there are so many female game characters in early gaming that I just don't have time to discuss them all.
Well, name a few. There's Alice Landale from Phantasy Star, Rosella from the King's Quest series, Konoko from Oni, Alyssa Dragoon, Yuko from Super Ballast 4, Josephine from Kendo Rage, Maria from The Legend of the Ghost Line, the Great Gianna Sisters, Laura Lewis, Joanna Dark, Kate Archer, Tears Flare, Blaze, Athena, Sonya Blade, Hiraku.
The only tragedy is that not all of these games were released outside of Japan. Do you hear that, North American developers? However, there are notable, sometimes overlooked games with female protagonists that were released for consoles in the US and Japan. The Guardian Legend was released in 1988 in Japan and 1989 in North America, and is credited with being developed by Matsumitsu Nitai, or as he's affectionately known as, Mu. He helped create games such as Zonak, Blazing Lasers, Dr. Robotnik's Bean Machine, Shadowrun, and Kirby's Avalanche. In the Guardian Legend, the player controls the female guardian of Earth, a highly sophisticated aerobot transformer. The Guardian's mission is to infiltrate Najul, a large planet-like object filled with aliens sent hurtling towards the Earth. While inside, the player must activate 10 safety devices in order to infiltrate Najul's self-destruct mechanism and destroy the alien world before it reaches Earth. The Guardian Legend has the best parts of games like The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, and Gun-Act. Not only was it one of the first to break gender barriers, it broke gaming genre barriers as well. Had mazes, power-ups, RPG elements, and space shooting elements, all with a female protagonist. The Guardian Legend was ahead of its time and undervalued then as it is now. If any NES game deserves an HD remake, it's this one. Let's not forget good old Princess Toadstool. And yes, she's named Toadstool. She was named Toadstool in the original Super Mario Bros. And the US version of Super Mario Bros. 2. In fact, up until Mario 64, Americans knew her as Princess Toadstool. She was always referred to as Peach in Japan. Few people in the US knew about Doki Doki Panic when Mario Bros. 2 Mario Madness was released in 1988. The game is awesome, so fuck anyone in your revisionist history bullshit who marginalizes the game because it is a port. I mean, in Doki Doki Panic, Toadstool replaced Lena, who was a woman in gaming, right? Lena counts, right? I mean, who cares if the princess is accidentally a playable character? It's not like she's the only character we have. And yes, she's a Toadstool here. In the original Super Mario Bros. Story, and yes, it has a story, she is first called Princess Toadstool, but everybody pretty much called her the princess after that. A bit more on Super Mario Bros. Story later. I didn't offer and discuss the lists of characters to say, see, they have female game characters, ladies. What are you complaining about, women? After all, this is supposed to be a damsel in distress tropes video response, right? But the truth is, the numbers of female protagonists are abysmally small in comparison to the total number of games released. Braun and Giroux in 1989 conducted one of the earliest studies about video game content. They observed that male characters were featured in almost 60% and female characters in only 2% of arcade games. A few years later, Dietz in 1998 analyzed 33 games on the Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis. 30% of the games did not have a female character in either the leading part or a supporting role. When the game did contain a female character, she was in 21% of the cases portrayed in a submissive, stereotypical position. Only 15% of the female characters attained the status of a hero in the game. The other female characters were princesses or wise old women, typically in a position to be released by the leading male character. And no, not all the characters escape negative cliches and stereotypes. However, I mention these female protagonists because they are games that were released and not games that were unfinished like Dinosaur Planet. Crystal, by the way. Hey, wait! It's not Crystal! Oh yeah, that's right. Dinosaur Planet was never intended to be a singular protagonist game. Of course, Sarkeesian slightly mentions and blows over that point, and then refers to Crystal starring in her own epic adventure. It's a misrepresentation to infer it was her game. Crystal and Saber are sort of siblings trying to find their father, a wizard named Randorn. Well, Saber is the real son, and Crystal was an orphan raised by the father. Apparently, Saber's older brother was killed in battle, and Randorn was so grief-stricken, he wandered into the wilderness never to be heard from again. This is where Randorn finds the orphan Crystal at a young age and adopts her as his own. How you'd have crossed paths in the game is not known, but the player would have switched using the Switch Zone, the rock-biter-looking thing on the island. Saber would have been accompanied by Tricky the Triceratops, the Earthwalker Prince. Crystal by Tricky's brother Rocky. Stars of the game from the beta were always Crystal and Saber. And Crystal has a crush on Saber. You play as both of them, as you can see by this previous magazine article. Of course, it is not like this information is linked and described on Sarkeesian's website or anything. Oh wait, yes it is. You play as Crystal in the beginning of Star Fox Adventures as well, for about 20 minutes in both the games, give or take a few, until you switch to a fox. As for this scene, well, there's no excuse for cheesy jazz music. See, even Peppy doesn't approve. The reality is, Dinosaur Planet would have crashed and burned harder than John Carter had it been released in 1998 or 2000. The Nintendo 64 was on its way out. Promoting that game with Crystal, especially the way Sarkeesian describes it in her own epic adventure, would have been disastrous. The reason is because in 1996, Core and Eidos Interactive released Tomb Raider with Lara Croft, and it altered the face of females in gaming forever as we will know it. In the original Tomb Raider series, Lara is the antithesis to the damsel in distress. She is strong, she is capable, and she is heroic, and it is reductionary to refer to her as a mere object of sexual attraction, because she is much, much more than that. And almost as much as Pac-Man fever swept the 1980s, Lara fever swept the 1990s. More on that later, too.
A trope is a common pattern in a story or a recognizable attribute in a character that conveys information to the audience. A trope becomes a cliché when it's overused.
Actually, that isn't what a trope is, and it bears some relevance in this discussion. Tropes and schemes are a part of classic rhetoric. The major medieval text on figures of speech is De Schematibus et Tropus by Venerable Bede. A figure of speech is defined as a scheme when a writer uses words in a non-standard order. This is alliteration, epistrophe, polysyndeton. It is a trope when a word is used in a non-standard way. You're probably familiar with tropes. Common ones are hyperbole, metaphor, euphemism, and oxymoron. Oxymoron. Oh, you, like practically everybody else on the planet, pronounce the word oxymoron, but the word is pronounced oxymoron. But if you say oxymoron, no one will know what the hell you're talking about, and you'll sound like an arrogant know-it-all. But if you say oxymoron, you're technically wrong. And I know, there are pedants out there who insist Ryu is never Ryu, it's Ryu or Ru, and it's never pronounced Ninja Gaiden, as if we should pronounce all the words borrowed from other languages correctly. So now we're in the manga dilemma. It's not croissant, it's croissant and clairvoyant. See, I can pronounce French words for little reason too. The internet, in its oh-so-infinite wisdom, has redefined and taken the word trope and given it a definition in the way Sarkeesian is using it. This means that tvtrope.org and she are both technically wrong. I know, this makes me seem like a pedant of the highest order of intellectual snobbery. It's not. This bears relevance on the connotation and definitions for this discussion. The initial premise of the Damsel in Distress video revolves around the idea that this is a common or reoccurring device which helps reinforce negative views of women. But the vernacular use of the word trope has come to mean something that conveys information to the audience. If this is true, then some patterns and attributes should also not convey information to the audience. In other words, when doesn't a story convey information to an audience? As Sarkeesian mentions, this trope can be combined with other ones as well. She discusses the smooch of victory trope being combined with the damsels in distress trope. The saying that either one of these is a trope is like calling a penguin a bird. Well, yes, a penguin is a bird, but so is a swan, a robin, an eagle, an owl, and an emu. Tropes are the class, the order, the category. If someone says to you, the damsel in distress is a trope, then your answer should be, oh good, what kind of a trope is it? What is worth noting is that games that have this motif are ones that seem to rise to the top in popularity. Now, is it that way because the motif is so prevalent that one cannot escape it? Or is it this way because there is something in the history of story that strikes a deeper chord in our being? In fact, this motif found its way into gaming because of its roots in story, oral tradition, and culture. And I think there is a profound reason for this. Our perceptions and cultures define story. Our cultures are story. One of the oldest stories we know is a Mesopotamian creation myth that features a god, Marduk, who confronts a reptilian monster, a dragon, her name is Tiamat, and makes the world out of the consequence of the conflict. He fights her, cuts her up into pieces, and out of the pieces he makes the world. Ancient people didn't think the way modern people do. They didn't share information the same way. They thought and shared information in story, which is a natural way for people to think. Now the Mesopotamians came to the conclusion that the object of their worship was the god who defeated the dragon of chaos and out of the pieces made the world. And that idea has rippled into the story throughout the ages. It's an idea that human beings have never lost. The earliest tale of a female in distress is inferred from the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian poem written about 2700 BC. Where Enki, the water god, fights Kur, who's often referred to as a dragon, after he learns the goddess Orishagal was carried off violently into the netherworld by Kur. Dragon, hero, damsel, sound familiar? Unfortunately for the audience, the author is so anxious to proceed with Gilgamesh's story, he or she doesn't finish with the dragon's demise. It is certain that Enki wins, though, because he is in the rest of the poem and Kur is not. It's not really a central plot point, but given what I've seen in the other video, it qualifies. Gods and humans really started interacting with Greek mythology. One of the most well-known, of course, is the story of Andromeda and Perseus. Andromeda was the daughter of Cephas and Cassiopeia, king and queen of the kingdom of Ethiopia. Cassiopeia bragged that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the nymph daughters of the sea god Nereus, who is often seen accompanying Poseidon. To punish the queen for her arrogance, Poseidon sent a sea monster, Cetus, to ravage the coast of Ethiopia. The king decided to consult the oracle of Apollo, who suggested he sacrifice his daughter to the monster. According to the myth, Perseus was flying using Hermes' boots while on his way home from slaying Medusa, and then turning a Titan and Atlas to stone. As he's flying, he notices her below and thinks she's a statue at first until he sees her hair blowing in the wind. Why this is of interest is because of the subject-object dichotomy Sarkeesian speaks about and reinforces with the videos from Mario Galaxy 2 and Mario Sports. She only helps his story arc because he marries her. Well, he steals her from another man, really. There is no definitive proof she was brought to sacrifice naked. In fact, according to Kyle M. Phillips Jr. in the American Journal of Archaeology, It was noted that a naked Andromeda was unusual in early art, and it appeared for the first time on a vase being sold in Italy in the 4th century. The original version of the myth, if there even was one, there may have been various contemporary variants, is not really recoverable. These stories were oral traditions. Andromeda's nudity was popularized by Renaissance painters, like the ones you see here. I think this bears relevance because while Andromeda is clearly a woman in distress, she was placed there by her parents for sacrifice. Metaphorically, to be naked implies having your veils of comfort stripped from you and increasing your vulnerability. This is why people frequently dream of being in public nude. To imply she is definitely nude in the original tale is misleading because that is ultimately uncertain. What is certain is Andromeda is about to be eaten by a large sea monster, Cetus. Her, Cetus, Kerr, Orishagel, King Kong, and Darrow as a giant monster is looming over them all. This consistency, beautiful woman, scary monster, highlights a common theme that we have seen pop up over many centuries in myths and fairy tales: Beauty and the Beast. Carl Jung discusses this in Man and His Symbols. Girls in our society share in the masculine hero myths because, like boys, they must develop a reliable ego identity and require an education. She begins to see that for a man, life is something that has to be taken by storm, as an act of heroic will. But for a woman to feel right about herself, life is best realized by a process of awakening. A universal myth expressing this kind of awakening is found in that fairy tale of Beauty and the Beast. The origins of the Beauty and the Beast and the damsel in distress, though, can predate to about 275 to 303 AD, to the tale of, and I don't know how the f*** someone omits this in a damsel in distress video, St. George and the Dragon. It is one of the most recreated and famous accounts of a knight saving a damsel in distress in history. According to the legend, a dragon was terrorizing the city of Selene in Libya. When the people ran out of sheep to feed it, they started feeding the dragon their children. Then an ordinance was made that the children and young people of the town should be chosen by lottery to feed the dragon. Whoever the lot fell upon, wealthy or poor, he or she was delivered to the dragon. The king's daughter was chosen. He tried to buy her way out, like a good rich father would do, but the village wouldn't let him. This is considered the original virgin sacrifice rescued by a knight, and this kind of tale could be traced through the Middle Ages as the precursors to Arthurian legend and courtly romance tales. The various representations of St. George and the Dragon share a lot of commonalities, as many symbolic artistic representations tend to do. Psychologist Jordan Peterson has a wonderful analysis of St. George and the Dragon mythos. Much of what I'm talking about stems from his analysis, so I encourage you to check it out. Now, this image is very intriguing, and everything is presented subtly and pictorially here. You have to admit, dragons are bizarre and frightening creatures. First of all, they aren't real. And they have really strange habits, kind of like hoarding gold, a lot of it, and trapping human virgins in their lairs, which is a really weird thing for a big lizard to do. You see the kingdom's castle in the background. The castle stands for society, tradition, and order. But there are things constantly trying to breach the walls and take over. That's why they were built, to keep the bad things out and to keep the good things in. Young people often get cynical as they hit their teens and college years. They get cynical because it looks like the world is falling further into catastrophe and environmental problems. Or they're cynical because there's still war, and there's still hunger, and there's still poverty, and there's still hate. So it's very easy for young people to look at the walls and see the cracks in the walls from things trying to tear it down and judge it. The truth of the matter is, throughout history, tradition has always been out of date and behind the times. And what you see in images of St. George and the Dragon is that the dragon has always disrupted the walls, which means tradition is always under attack from the contemporary, or chaos is trying to come in and take over order. But that doesn't mean everything from the past should be abandoned. Because if you abandon the past and get rid of all your walls that support you, then you will leave yourself vulnerable and naked and could fall into a realm of chaos, and that, metaphorically speaking, is what hell on earth is. St. George is a different kind of person. When the walls come under attack, he decides to voluntarily go out and confront the dragon. You see in most images of St. George there is a cave. The idea is that the thing that lurks underneath, way down under the dark ground, in a terrifying place, crawls out to threaten the structure of everything you know. St. George goes out and confronts it, and this image rescues the virgin that the dragon has been guarding. This means something. It means that the things you're afraid of and can't do in life are the things you should fight for. It means that the things that terrify you have things of value. That's what the image of the dragon hoarding gold has come to mean. It also means something else as well. It means the individual man who is willing to go out and fight chaos when tradition is crumbling will be more likely to find a mate. As far as the damsel in distress is concerned, in video games the female is kidnapped, snatched by unforeseen evil forces, and not offered for sacrifice in most instances. There are games like Splatterhouse 2010 where Rick and Jennifer are captured by Dr. West, whose plan is to bring the dark deities known as the corrupted into this world by sacrificing Jennifer. and in Rondo of Blood, where Shaft is using Maria, Tara, and Iris to bring back Dracula from the dead. For the most part in gaming, the woman is captured, and sometimes the story will offer a reason. Maybe we call that rationalizing. This kidnapping archetype is common for reasons that may be opaque at first glance. The roots of this model go much deeper in tradition, culture, and story, but these origins do not lean naturally into a fascination with primates. In Edgar Rice Burroughs' 1912 book, Tarzan himself is described as being an ape man. Jane is carried off by what one of the other characters, Esmeralda, describes as a gorilla fan. When Tarzan runs off to rescue Jane, the novel reads as follows. When Turkos saw that it was Tarzan who pursued him, he jumped to the conclusion that this was Tarzan's woman, since they were of the same kind, white and hairless. And so he rejoiced at this opportunity for double revenge upon his hated enemy. While it is not explicitly stated Tarzan's rival is a man, it is inferred from the text that Turkos is as he is. So Jane was never taken by a primate. In The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, also released in 1912, Professor, Challenger, Summerlee, and Roxton are captured by a race of ape-like men. While in the Ape Men's village, they find out there is also a tribe of humans calling themselves the Akala, but they are still captured by ape-like men and not apes. We could go back 17 years to 1895 in H.G. Wells' Time Machine, where the ape-like primitives are Morlocks, or to Swift's Gulliver's Travels in 1726, where the Winhams contrast the primitive Yahoos. Or how about even 1841, where Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in Rue Morgue that was published in Graham Magazine, when the murderer of the mystery turns out to be an actual orangutan. I think what should be kept more in mind with Tarzan, the Time Machine, and the Lost World is that they are not all that long after Charles Darwin started publishing his work. Descent of Man was published in 1871, that's a mere 46 years. For context, Kurt Cobain, Liz Phair, Vin Diesel, Julia Roberts, Phil Lamar, and Will Ferrell were all born in 1967, so the stories did not come out that long after Darwin's works. People are still debating about natural selection and evolution today. So given some of the details I mentioned, it doesn't feel like there's a strong connection between Tarzan, Mickey Mouse, King Kong, and this propaganda poster, especially since the poster was made in 1917 and is supposed to be an insult to Kaiser Wilhelm, hence the mustache. The silent film version of The Lost World in 1925 highly influenced King Kong. The original creators were Marion Cooper and screenwriter Edgar Wallace. He wrote the first draft of King Kong, originally titled The Beast, between December 1931 and January 1932. Marion Cooper encouraged them to use a lot of footage from a canceled 1931 film called Creation. It was about people encountering dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals on an island. This is why there are dinosaurs with King Kong on the island. What is significant in all the stories I have mentioned is the maiden being offered up for sacrifice to a large beast, the unknown, nature, chaos in its most untrammeled state, in an attempt to control it and tame it. Those two areas are significant when it comes to this archetype in relation to video games as we know it. 1. The woman is placed in peril by her peers or family. In the classic archetypes, aside from Gilgamesh I have mentioned, the damsel is not kidnapped but forcibly placed there. Now, I'm in no way attempting to make the claim that in the previous stories there are not examples of women in distress or subjugation. While they still place the female in an inferior objective type state for some to interpret, I think that the distress archetype should bear some relevance on how the woman gets there. 2, it sets the stage for the motif to be a white or whitish woman, a white blonde woman, which Sarkeesian never mentions at all. What, no one wants to take on the subject of women in color in video games? You know those silent films where the woman gets tied to the train tracks by evil, twisting mustache men? Well, it was really a cliche when it started. This was started by Augustin Daly in his play Under the Gaslight in 1867. It went on to be recreated in various plays and films until no one could use the twisting mustache if you wanted your villain to be taken seriously. It also turns out there is a 1914 American film serial that is considered the quintessential damsel in distress. The title? Perils of Pauline. And you know, The Perils of Pauline was so popular, they made it into 2 feature films, one in 1947 and turned it into a slapstick comedy in 1967. Now, I can't prove it explicitly, but that seems more than a mere coincidence. I would wager the fascination with apes comes from the history of gorillas in film and this connection with The Perils of Pauline, especially Jumpman's Pauline. I think what also should be noted is that at the time of maybe 1965 through the early 80s, there was a fascination with primates in popular culture as well. It resurfaced then, and probably Planet of the Apes' success takes a lot of credit for that. Grape Ape, Magilla Gorilla, Chim Chim, Monchi Cheese, Bubbles, Lancelot Link, Any Which Way But Loose, BJ and the Bear. Surely Miyamoto was in contact with those when he had the idea for Donkey Kong and a man's pet monkey to steal his girlfriend. It certainly seems to be a stronger pop cultural connection than a serial novel from 1912 and a Mickey Mouse cartoon. And I know Sarkeesian is merely discussing a motif, patterns where females are subjugated and objectified. The fact that, as a pop culture critic, her pop culture connections are flimsy at best does not take away from her initial assertions. If one is going to make connections, though, then they should not only be accurate and fully represented, but they should probably make sense. In 1980, Nintendo had a few arcade hits in Japan. They wanted a piece of that sweet American arcade market companies like Taito were experiencing, so they outsourced and made 3,000 radar scope games for the United States, because the game was a huge hit in Japan. The game wasn't a hit and they had to revamp. Enter Miyamoto and his idea for a game that eventually led to Donkey Kong. The video game nerd lore is that his early inspirations were Popeye and King Kong. Donkey Kong became a massive hit. I think this is mostly because if you check the arcades prior to 1983, players controlled everything but a person. Jumpman was one of the first characters who looked like a recognizable person in the arcade. It was also one of the first platformers. Most games were shooters and racers prior to 1983. Couple that with Saving Your Girlfriend Pauline, and it's a creation for success. This is really where popular gaming culture has taken into the princess being rescued idea. Only because we could never forget soon after, sorry but our princess is in another castle from Super Mario Bros. But I think most people have forgotten the story. Yes, there is a story, and I too forgot it until I read the account in The Perils of the Princess, Genre and Genre in Video Games by Sharon R. Sherman in Western Folklore. The story goes like this. One day, the kingdom of the peaceful mushroom people was invaded by the Koopa, a tribe of turtles famous for their black magic. The quiet, peace-loving mushroom people were turned into mere stones, bricks, and even field horsehair plants, and the mushroom kingdom fell into ruin. The only one who can undo the magic spell is the Princess Toadstool, daughter of the Mushroom King. Unfortunately, she is presently in the hands of the great Koopa Turtle King. Mario, the hero of the story, maybe, hears about the mushroom people's plight and sets out on a quest to free them from the evil Koopa and restore the fallen kingdom. You are Mario. It is up to you to save the mushroom people from the black magic of the Koopa. While Koopa and the other Koopalings retain their use of magic, they have certainly downplayed that whole black part since then. I guess the Mushroom King died along with Princess Toadstool's magic. Why did she lose it? When did she lose it? I guess Mario has always had a kind of magic, what with the mushrooms and fire flowers and feathered Tukani suit. But in this instance of the subject-object dichotomy, at least the first go-around, Toadstool was a magic ball that was going to free the kingdom of a black magic curse set by Koopa. You are not rescuing the princess because she is inherently helpless. You are rescuing her because she holds the power to free her people. The inference that could be drawn here is that she was captured not just because she was female, but because she holds the magic powerful enough to stop Koopa's own. And while true, she has not been a playable character again in the main Mario franchise since Super Mario Bros. 2, the US version, I would argue that the spin-offs are franchises in their own right. The subject-object dichotomy is a philosophical issue and analysis of human experience that arises from the premise the world is made of objects. In this sense, Peach is being transformed from a captured person to an object of possession. How this bears relevance in this instance is that much like Andromeda or Cleodolina in St. George and the Dragon, Peach is threatened by a dark, unforeseen force rising up to take her. Chaos versus order, if you will. A monster that lurks underneath and comes out to threaten structure. If you're like the females in the classic stories I talked about, then you are being offered for sacrifice. I imagine this to be different than abductions, which are far more common in video games. I mean, against the odds of a horde of people sacrificing you, what normal person would not need to be rescued? There are many tenets to the subject-object part of feminist epistemology. The one that is interesting in terms of how Sarkeesian is using it is producing theories of women that represent them as inferior, deviant, or significant only in the ways they serve male interests. And this is certainly true in a number of games that exploit this archetype. Wizards and Warriors and even Double Dragon are examples. However, given the plots of the original Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, the females in those games are not only significant for male interests. Placing the princess in the objective case as the ball the men are fighting over seems disingenuous to the plot of the games and story. I mean, is Mario voluntarily setting out on the quest, collecting all that gold, risking his safety as the ground shifts beneath him because Bowser wants to fight over Peach to have her for himself? Bowser isn't even human. He's like a fire-breathing turtle dragon. The double down that Sarkeesian is referring to when it comes to Miyamoto and Zelda is different from the very first game. Don't even try to follow the Zelda timeline. It's an exercise in futility. You can't make logical sense of it. It is worth noting that in the original story, Ganon invades in order to plunge the world into darkness. It is Zelda herself who splits the Triforce and hides the pieces throughout the kingdom. When Ganon realizes she hid the pieces, he imprisons her. So, Link is really fighting through her dungeons and puzzles, right? Yeah, she is disempowered, but I would argue she empowers herself if she created the dungeons and the magical items and hid all the pieces of the Triforce. Ganon can't kill her, otherwise he'll never find the pieces. So she beat him with her intelligence. And while this happened to Zelda, it seems she was fully aware of the repercussions of hiding the pieces, right? She knew she would be imprisoned. So if they had all the time to build all those dungeons, Ganon's army moves really slow, doesn't it? In 1996, the video game world was turned on its head with the release of Tomb Raider. Games released around that time were Mega Man X3, Ristar, Super Mario RPG, The Lost World, Jurassic Park, Chrono Trigger, Vector Man, Sonic 3D, Donkey Kong Country 2, Earthbound, and I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Pre-Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII, Tomb Raider easily rose to the top of the PlayStation 1 library, giving the system its first taste of a decent f***ing game aside from Resident Evil. And while Jill Valentine clearly predates Lara as a strong female protagonist who happens to fall into a world killing zombies, she never would rise to Lara levels for a number of reasons. One, I'm going to guess this cutscene has a lot to do with it.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine.
Joseph!
No! Don't go!
Even in 1996, no one took it seriously. Two, it's because of the genre of the game. As both Chris and Jill, you're placed in survival horror and are vulnerable and purposely weakened. Though much should be said that Chris is less significantly weaker and Jill is the easier player to start with. When you first played the game in 1996, it was new, hard as hell to control, and you ran your ass off from everything. You didn't feel strong or as adventurous as either character for a long time. Lara was different. Created by Toby Gard, she is simultaneously the most popular and controversial female gaming heroine. She is part Indiana Jones, part Clint Eastwood, part Samus Aran, all badass. What made the original Metroid game memorable was the utter sense of solitude one could get from exploring the planet Zebes. In Tomb Raider, for an adventure game with puzzles of sorts, trying to figure out, you truly were alone trying to get through these massive tombs. Gamers hadn't ever seen a game that was presented in a world with this immense. Lara was the first major character and heroine to have massive rooms to explore and puzzles to solve with no help. According to Wikipedia, and we know how academically reliable they are, Swedish pop artist Nina Cherry was inspiration for Lara's early designs. Buffalo stance? Really? She was originally designed as a South American woman named Lara Cruz, but IDOS wanted a more British-friendly origin of Croft and thus pushing strides back for women of color and race in gaming. She is the original Barney badass in gaming though. Think of one prior to her. There were some, but none with her attitude. What, Jimmy and Bimmy? Lance and Bill? Hager? Simon Belmont? Roston? Shinobi? The naval hacker from System Shock? Ed Carnby from Alone in the Dark? There were some, but consoles did not show them off well and PCs were just starting to take off into the mainstream. Sure, the characters kicked ass in their own right, but none of them had Lara's air of confidence. She possessed an over-the-top, ostentatious display of arrogance and conceit, a strut that conveyed insolence, defiance, and a disrespect for authority. She didn't seem to have reservations or fear or worry. She killed fucking T-Rexes with a pair of pistols. Massive caverns and canals to explore, traps to avoid, Lara did not become the bit girl of the 1990s because she is a hot woman, but rather because of the quality of the game in relation to the other games that came out within a couple years to her game. There is no comparison, and truthfully, if you were to imagine Lara were a man in the game, maybe Lucas Croft, the game would not have played out the same, at least not at that time. Hell, a competitor in the Uncharted franchise did not come out until 2007, and Nathan Drake, as charming as he is played as a bumbling comedic hero. Tomb Raider would have never succeeded as it did with a male protagonist in 1996. I don't think players would have cared as much about his plight. As far as Lara's sexuality is concerned, it wasn't played up much in the actual game. Yes, she is a woman, but the unrealistic part really is that she's wearing short shorts while spelunking. In retrospect, look at her. There's nothing sexy about her. at least compared to the dreck they publish now. It's the public that turned her into a sex idol, and the company and the media has certainly played upon this ever since.
What makes you sweat? Is it passion? Or could it just be heat? What about not knowing if your very next breath will be your last? What about all three? Tomb Raider from IDOS Interactive.
In Does Lara Croft Wear Fake Polygons? Anne-Marie Schleiner classifies Lara in several categories. Among these are Lara as Frankenstein monster, Lara as drag queen, Lara as dominatrix femme fatale, and Lara as a positive role model. As a female Frankenstein monster, she is like an offspring of science, an idealized, eternally young female techno puppet created for men to stare at. Some feminists see this as a disturbing trend in gaming culture where boys and men are reinforced by unrealistic body ideals.
When toys for boys become more than toys.
Originally, when I first got her, I called her my synthetic girlfriend. But it's actually progressed to the point where it's like, she's my wife.
37-year-old Dave Cat from Detroit says he has been in a relationship with his sex doll for more than 10 years. And it's in it, or in her, that he found his better half.
Just let her sleep. It's not even worth getting her out of bed at this point.
You know, the interesting part of this argument is that it only takes the perspective of the heterosexual male of being the one who is doing the actual gaming. So given that, Lara as drag queen, then the predominantly male players of the games like Tomb Raider are drawn in to identify with Lara by being immersed in the combat and puzzles. Lara operates as an externalized Lacanian mirror image of the subject, or player. In his essay, The Mirror Image, Jacques Lacan identifies the key moment when an infant first recognizes his or her reflection in the mirror. This perception of the self and develops and extends throughout an individual's lifetime. The argument can then be made over the course of the game that the construction of the player's feminine identity emerges from this reflective connectivity young boys and men get to experiment by virtually putting on this feminine outfit. This is certainly true in many MMORPGs and early dungeon crawlers and MUDs. With Lara as a dominatrix or femme fatale, men may gain sadistic or even masochistic pleasure from defeating enemies in the game who are often male. It's possible that they may be, in fact, unconsciously aware why they might have an affinity for playing a character who they perceive to be the weaker sex, when in reality they are gaining some type of pleasure from trying on a female persona and defeating men. And then we get to Lara as being a positive role model. We can look at Deborah Tannen and Tracy Higgins' article, How Being a Good Girl Can Be Bad for Women.
Goodness, what beautiful diamonds. Goodness had nothing to do with it, dearie.
Violent, capable, and sexy women like Lara Croft might be better role model for girls than the few games that have been targeted specifically for girls. Think of Fashion Designer, The Littlest Pet Shop, Diner Dash, and Nanny Mania. Whatever you want to label her as, Lara is not the bimbo stereotype, the vapid battle trophy princess. Her backstory is that of a highly educated and adventurous upper-class British woman. She's adept at combat techniques and puzzle solving. Given the kinds of women represented in gaming, Lara is by far a positive step forward. It turns out, in terms of Lara, her sexuality hardly comes into play if you're a gamer. And I mean this. Published in the journal Sex Roles in 2009, Elizabeth Bem Marowitz and Dana Mastro wanted to study the short-term effects of exposure to sexualized female video game characters on gender stereotyping and female self-concept in emerging adults. In short, they wanted to see if playing a sexualized or non-sexualized female character had an effect on the player. They chose two versions of Lara Croft for users to play in their study when looking at differences across the sexualized and non-sexualized conditions. Now, their research is extensive, so you'll have to bear with me for a moment. They had some predictions about what the study might reveal. Playing games with certain female characters will predict player beliefs about physical, career, domestic roles, and abilities when it comes to gender. Playing with a sexualized female character will result in greater belief in traditional gender roles in comparison with playing a non-sexualized female character or no video game at all. Significant differences emerge for females when looking at the differences across the two versions of Lara. Females playing the sexualized version reported less favorable attitudes towards women than female participants who played the non-sexualized or no video game at all. This suggests that playing the sexualized character resulted in less favorable attitudes towards women with regard to women's physical capabilities. This was not the case for male participants. Men did not report differences in attitudes when playing either character. For women, Playing the sexualized Lara resulted in lower self-efficacy in comparison to playing the non-sexualized Lara or no video game at all. This suggests that exposure to sexualized images of women in video games, at least among female players, may reduce confidence in their ability to succeed in the real world. In the game, the two character portrayals were identical in almost every way except for the degree of sexualization of their appearance. The findings from their study show that sexualized video game images of females can negatively affect women's feelings of self-efficacy. They did predict, however, that playing a non-sexualized female video game player may result in greater self-esteem in female players in comparison to playing a sexualized female character. Their findings did not show this. In other words, their study does not provide any support for the idea that, for women, playing a non-sexualized character or even a same-sex character of either a sexualized or non-sexualized nature positively or negatively affects levels of self-esteem. Overall, findings from this study suggest that the level of sexualization of female video game characters has limited effects on players' gender stereotyping. Second, playing the sexualized character for female participants resulted in less favorable judgments about female physical capabilities. Specifically, women who played the sexualized character were more likely to agree with statements suggesting that women were less physically capable in comparison to men, whereas the women who played the non-sexualized character were less likely to agree with such assertions. This indicates that even though the sexualized heroine was very physically able, playing this character led to greater gender stereotyping on the dimension of physical ability. It is unclear, however, why similar results did not emerge on the other two gender role dimensions, appearance and career and domestic work or anything else. What is interesting is that there was no clear evidence or trend that emerged from examining the means for the male participants. The failure to achieve significance in the data may be a consequence of inadequate statistical power, or it might mean that no such effects exist. Oh, but these studies are not only done for women and men about women. Christopher B. Bartlett and Richard J. Harris performed a study on both men and women, where the participants played with characters of their own gender who are muscular and skinny. Overall, the results suggest this study that when male participants played a video game that emphasized muscular male bodies, they had an increase in their negative body image. Specifically, these results showed that those who played the video game independent of condition had a decrease in positive feelings toward their body. They had a decrease in general body esteem and had a decrease in their positive attitudes towards muscularity. They also had a decrease in the drive for muscularity in general. This suggests that participants' affective and cognitive component of a negative body image were significantly impacted by video gameplay. The results of this current study suggest that women participants after playing a game emphasized that the female body felt significantly worse about their bodies as well. Specifically, it was found that women had a decrease in their positive feelings toward their body and a marginal decrease in their positive feelings of their sexual attractiveness. Interestingly, the results showed that there was not a significant change in the participants' body satisfaction scores. Women in gaming have made a lot of strides, but honestly, they're probably not enough. I would like to play a game where a female character is not overly sexualized, stereotyped, or really cardboard. But then again, I long to play any character that is not a walking, bubbling cliche of stupid, since story and cutscenes have become the de facto norm in gaming. Having said that, women in gaming will never stop being overly sexualized until television and film stop doing it, until culture stops doing it.
So what was really disturbing is that we found a lot of hypersexuality of the female characters in even television and movies aimed at little kids. There was research that just came out that showed that girls as young as 6 years old have started to self-sexualize. In other words, they have started seeing themselves through the male gaze and realizing that they need to be sexy in order to be appreciated.
Some girls now feel pressure to deliver porn star performance.
Anal is becoming the new oral.
Smartphones and social media make it possible not only for kids to consume X-rated images, but to produce them with devastating consequences.
My heart just dropped. I was like, how many people have seen me like this?
The damsel in distress cliché is a commentary on culture more so than it is on gaming, as this plot point device exists in films, cheesy romance novels, and bodice rippers, whose primary audience is female. This archetype does not exist in order to subconsciously or consciously propagate the subjugation, inferiority, or weakness of women, or to even foster male ejaculatory wet dreams in gameplay. It stems from a long tradition of story and culture. The arc of the hero archetype is not to simply bolster male fantasies of saving the girl, although that is certainly a large part of it. In Resistance Through Video Gameplay, It's a Boy Thing, Kathy Sanford and Leanna Madill discussed how these themes often overlap as they interviewed participants who talked about why they played games. One adult male was asked what characteristics of video game characters he admired. He responded,
I'd like to have a big body, a six-pack, not an eight-pack. I'd like to be built. I don't want to be a drug dealer, king of the city.
When he was asked what about saving the girl, he answered,
That would be neat. I've often had dreams about that. Meeting a girl doing something courageous, you know?
Another adult participant commented on his desire to be a hockey player.
I didn't ever play hockey. I don't know the rules. But in the game, I'm always trying to start a body check or start a fight.
Not all men are strong and full of machismo in real life, but they may want to try on that role through fantasy gameplay. An online experience allows one to extend this feeling of empowerment so that digitally shooting another player feels satisfying. Another example of resistance within gaming is the type of game or game character that player selects to play. The character is often strong, independent rebel. Think of Max Payne or all the Grand Theft Auto games, Manhunt, Counter-Strike, Prototype, Infamous, the list goes on. The characters are really independent, not like anybody else. Precludes them from making choices in characters who seem weak, dependent, or feminine. The researchers noted, we did not find evidence that learners were thinking consciously and reflectively about cultural models of the world, or that they were consciously reflecting on the values that make up their real or video game world. So maybe the vast majority of males in video games are independent, overly macho, rebellious, because the vast majority of males who play the games are not so overly macho, independent, and rebellious. This gives them a chance to try on the persona when they play the games. This is also why when people post online or act as a different avatar when they're posting in comments, they put on this same kind of persona. I don't know if you could believe Google, but there is a marked difference between the results in the news section if you search woman kidnapped versus man kidnapped. I'm not making the value judgment whether or not this kind of art, if you want to call it that, should imitate life in any way when I'm talking about women being kidnapped in video games. You can make that determination. What I am saying is that across the world, women and children seem to be kidnapped and taken far more frequently than men are. Is it backwards to allow aspects of that reality to enter into video games? I don't know if it is necessary, but by omitting it, are we admitting games are not created for adults? Or are we confusing weaker with capability across the board? Because that is different. I guess if anything, men use games as a place to comfortably roleplay and express the ideas of machismo, hypermasculinity, and femininity. I wouldn't be the first person to suggest that feminism, at least hyperfeminism, hurts men and masculinity in general. If you live in the world, you already know that men are generally physically stronger and that the notion that women are weaker than men is not false. Now, before you start yelling at me and offering up examples of someone you know who can bench press a new Ford Ranger with their nails freshly painted while giving birth and doing taxes at the same time, calm down. I mean generally, statistically, there will always be outliers in statistics. Games, as pretty much everything else in material life, do not exist in a vacuum, and much of the world still possesses and perpetuates sexist views, and this often happens willfully and purposefully. But we have to be careful as to what we label backwards and sexist. Views that are contrary to your own may be just that, contrary, and not sexist. But men are stronger. I bring this up because I'm responding to this assertion of Sarkeesian's later in her video.
We have to remember that these games don't exist in a vacuum. They're an increasingly important and influential part of our larger social and cultural ecosystem. The reality is, this trope is being used in a real-world context where backward sexist attitudes are already rampant. It's a sad fact that a large percentage of the world's population still clings to the deeply sexist belief that women as a group need to be sheltered, protected, and taken care of by men.
The belief that women are somehow a naturally weaker gender is a deeply ingrained, socially constructed myth, which of course is completely false. But the notion is reinforced and perpetuated when women are continuously portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures.
1. According to the research I've discussed, she is not really correct. 2. There isn't a non-real-world context where the games or even the motifs exist. 3. She is once again misusing language. Ability is not analogous to strength as it is capability. Males are stronger. I'm not offering this up as any kind of criticism. We run most of the world, and rightly so, because of this reality. When men get into a fight, it can be horrifying, entertaining, or even humorous at times. When women fight each other, there can be similar results. I cannot say for certain, but I know if you have an ounce of humanity within you, something happened when you watched this clip intermixed with the others.
Where is my fucking PlayStation then? Where is my
Keep on
fucking
breaking
PlayStation?
stuff and then I'll have no choice but to call the cops.
It's my TV. Don't
Get
even
out.
start.
Get out, Sean.
Don't even
Alfred,
fucking
I'm
start.
protecting myself.
No, you're not.
Get out.
Don't start. Move,
No.
please. It's my TV. It's not yours. Fucking bitch.
Obviously, I don't know what you felt, but I gather it was not the same emotion you felt watching the others. Again, rightly so. It is true that the man rescuing a damsel robs her of her becoming a heroine in her own story in most instances. It also robs the man of becoming an object of desire. The repeated use of this keeps a particular character from being a heroine, but it is not stopping anyone from creating a new, interesting, independent character to star in her new game. It's also not stopping anyone from flipping the script, as recent modders have done for their young daughters. Last year, Mike Hoy had changed the pronouns in Wind Waker so that Link was female and Zelda was male. Mike Mika recently modded Donkey Kong so Pauline could save Jumpman. Kenna W modded The Legend of Zelda so you could play as Zelda and save Link. Hey developers, add an option that allows people to play as a female Sonic or Mega Girl instead of making modding communities do it. How much work is this for you to do the palette swap? Anything good or memorable about classic characters has already been destroyed by you. It's not like you can further hurt their legacies. As I mentioned, it seems that these ideas about the weakness and inferiority of women come from other places, and gaming seems to have little effect on the negative views, particularly when it comes to males. The trope robs those characters of the chance of becoming heroines in their own right, and it kind of assumes that they have some sort of right to be there in the first place. The pattern of presenting women as weak, ineffective, or incapable can have larger repercussions beyond their characters and their games. That is, of course, if one chooses to interpret the kidnapping of a specific character or woman as being indicative or representational of all women rather than that particular woman. Does the damsel in distress cliché as a recurring motif help to normalize extremely toxic, patronizing, and paternalistic attitudes about women? Or does it help to teach adolescents that they should go out and actually fight chaos when it threatens order, rather than being the anti-hero in an open-world sandbox environment? There's another familiar tale from Greek mythology that has a message for us as well. The story of Daedalus and Icarus, where one of our most beloved heroes gets his name. Icarus' father, Daedalus, was a master craftsman, and he was commissioned to create an elaborate labyrinth for King Minos of Crete to imprison the Minotaur. Daedalus revealed the secret of the labyrinth to Ariadne, Minos' daughter. When Minos found out about the betrayal, he imprisoned Daedalus and Icarus inside the labyrinth. The rest of the myth is where people tend to get familiar with it. Daedalus fashioned a pair of wax wings for himself and Icarus so they can escape the island. He warns his son not to fly too high to the sun or the wax wings would melt and the wings would not work. Icarus does not heed his father's warning and he flies too high and plummets into the sea. It is a story of hubris and failed ambition, a warning about moderation and the dangers of technology and obeying your elders. There is a part of the Icarus story that gets left out in modern times. Daedalus also warned Icarus not to fly too low to the sea or the wings would get wet and ruined. We should not aim our ambitions too low either and keep the current circumstances. The safe path in life is the easy path. Billions of us follow that path every day. If you're lucky, you get a gold watch in retirement, but mostly you just get old. This path is average. Your dreams get pushed aside for convenience and comfort. Fear is what creeps in and it owns you. It's what makes people in debt with an MBA they didn't really want and a family they thought would make them happy. You resent yourself and your choices, and you start to feel guilty for blaming those close to you. And after a while, you may begin to believe you aren't extraordinary or capable, and you resign to the fact that you've settled for safe. People who needlessly attack Sarkeesian are flying too close to the sea. Don't be afraid of change or things that can upset the status quo. The world can give us better women in gaming than it has, but it can give us better people in gaming than it has too. All representations in gaming have an uphill battle. Before we start making demands on the gaming industry and media as a whole, maybe we should start making them on ourselves. We change ourselves, we change the culture, we change the world, the games follow.